Hello everyone, welcome to Neoscience Hub. Today we have a very distinguished guest with us who has done extensive work in food engineering, more specifically in extrusion technology, which is commonly used in packaged foods like quick bites. Our Neoscience Hub editor, Dr. Subramaniam S. Iyer, will be talking to Professor Dr. Sajid Alavi of Kansas State University, USA. Dr. Alvi received his BS in Agricultural Engineering from Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, India in 1995. MS in Agricultural and Biological Engineering from Pennsylvania State University, Pennsylvania in 1997 and Ph.D. in Food Science, Food Engineering from Cornell University, Ithaca, New York in 2001. He joined the Department of Grain Science and Industry at Kansas State University in 2002. Dr. Alvi's research interests lie in extrusion processing of food and feed materials, rheology, food microstructure imaging, and structure-texture relationships. Welcome, Professor Dr. Alvi.
Dr. Alvi, let's start with your work on
Sure.
plant proteins, which is quite interesting. And we were, in fact, much gung-ho about the work what you do because we wanted someone to actually replicate the animal meat using a plant-based. So I would like to know how would you make that more bioavailable vis-a-vis the animal meat?
Well, the raw materials for plant-based meat have been available forever, as long as meat has been available, because plant-based meat is based on plant proteins. And plant proteins can include a whole range of different sources, including wheat, which of course is a very abundant crop in India, also soybeans, and more recently some of the pulse crops, which were traditionally not used in plant-based proteins. They also have been incorporated into these products, including yellow peas as an example, or beans, fava beans, and so on. So the resources or the raw materials for plant-based meat have been around. The only difference is that now the technology has evolved and it has made the separation of these plant proteins easier, and also these plant proteins have become relatively more available, cheaper to be able to be used in plant-based meat applications, because you cannot use whole soybeans, or you cannot use whole wheat for these applications. You have to separate or isolate the proteins. So that technology has been around for a little bit, but now it's more widely available, and these proteins can be used isolated first or separated first from the original plant source, like the wheat grain, for example. You can separate out wheat gluten, which is the wheat protein, or from soybeans, you can separate out soy proteins in the form of isolates or concentrates. And these are what are used for plant-based meat. Another thing which has happened, of course, is the technology for production of these plant-based meat products, the processing system which converts plant proteins into meat-like texture. But in terms of abundance of the raw materials, they've been around, for as much as meat has been around. Maybe a little less, because agriculture, of course, evolved later on. But in the world of food processing, these ingredients have been available for a long time. So they are abundant, but obviously as demand for plant-based meat increases, then this sector of plant proteins, that needs to increase as well in terms of the crops and such. So, but hopefully the demand can keep up with the supply.
Okay, so just rejoining that to the same question, do you think this is going to replace the animal protein once the kind of technology gets mature?
Right. Well, it's a great question again. It just depends on whether we're talking on the societal level or talking about individual level. On the individual level, yes, a lot of people have made the choice of going from animal proteins to plant proteins for various reasons, from a point of view of health, from a point of view of concern for the environment, from the point of view of also animal welfare. These are various issues why people would make a switch from animal protein to plant protein. Plant-based meat, from animal meat to plant-based meat. So individually, yes, people are making those changes as people are becoming more aware and more conscious of these various concerns I mentioned. On a societal level, Yes, to an extent, this change is already happening, this transition, but I don't believe animal protein will ever be replaced. I think animal protein is going to be around. It's just going to be complementing plant proteins in plant-based foods, be it, you can also call milk, by the way, an animal-based food. You can also, of course, meat is animal-based food. So they're going to be around, but plant protein will just become a bigger complement, will play a bigger role in the coming years because of all these reasons. Because there's also a movement, by the way, in the agricultural processing and technology area of using cultured meat, which will take care of a lot of these concerns, especially around animal welfare. So when there are no animals involved, you can have cultured meat, and that's animal meat. So maybe that will also, as it's growing slowly, be a big segment of the market. So I don't foresee a complete switch from animal meat to plant-based meat, but it's going to become more diversified in the coming years.
Super. Nice to hear that. Okay, you've almost mastered the extrusion technology. Okay, extrusion technology, how is it going to help us in this particular area of work? Because extrusion is like a very mature technology, almost more than 5 or 6 decades. It's an old one. It covers all the manufacturing setup. How do you think that is going to help you in this particular work?
Well, extrusion, as you're right, Dr. Ayer, has been around for years, maybe around 100 years in the area of food processing, and maybe 200 years in the area of other materials like plastics, metals, rubber. So extrusion has been around for a long time. The processing technology, like I said, it has been in the industry, very widely used for non-food materials for much longer, since 1800s. Only in the last 100 years or so, it has evolved to be used for processing food products, but that's a long time still. And even in the last 20, 30 years, the technology has adapted itself, has evolved like any other technology, and has improved in various ways with new innovations and new developments, new technology, which has been incorporated into the processing. So it's really very versatile technology. The same technology, this is really used for making all kinds of products. The same technology can be used for making breakfast cereal, for making snack products, for making pet food products even. I just got a inquiry or some request for help from an Indian company actually, which is diversifying from aquatic feed and other kinds of animal feed to pet food. And that's something that we all recognize. The Indian market for pet food is really increasing as people have more disposable income. They have smaller families, nuclear families. They have a need, really. It's not just a luxury anymore. Sometimes these older couples who don't have kids at home anymore, they have a need for having a companion, and pets are those companions. So that's also diversifying into an Indian market that's been around in the US for a long time, into pet food. So that company was asking me about how do we formulate these pet food products, and they were requiring some help. So that's also a huge segment where extrusion is used. It's also used for making pasta products. All kinds of pasta products are made by extrusion or technologies similar to extrusion. So it's really a whole range of products. So when you say kurkure, that's extruded product. When you look at Cocoa Puffs or Cheerios or Fruit Loops, all these breakfast cereal products, they're also extruded products. So it's very versatile, and it's very useful for making plant-based meat. In fact, most plant-based meat products which are out there in the market, Indian market is still very nascent. It's only just evolving, but the market is literally bigger in, say, the US and also European countries. So extrusion is really central to processing of these products. So it's used for cooking plant proteins, and it's also used for, in the same process, texturizing or cross-linking these plant proteins to get them a stringy texture like meat has. Plant proteins by themselves don't have a very stringy texture. So you can imagine tofu. If someone has had tofu, which is a soy-based, almost a paneer-like product. So tofu is a very soft product. I won't call it texturized. It's been heat processed to gel. So it makes a gel, and so that even yogurt is a gel. So tofu is not a texturized, stringy-like product. It's nowhere near tasting like meat. But the same soy proteins, when they're processed in an extruder, the proteins are cross-linked to make them very stringy, to get the meat-like texture. So very different from what tofu is. You actually get a product which is chewy, and which has the springiness and the hardness, and which kind of chews down like meat does. So that's all part of the texturization process, along with cooking of the protein, which happens in the extruder. And an extruder, a commercial extruder, can cook as much as 2 or 3 tons per hour, or even more, one machine. And a lot of the processing plants have several of these extruders side by side. So you can imagine you can process 20, 30 tons per hour. In a day, you could be making 1,000 tons, depending on, of course, what you're making and what the capacity of your system and your plant is. So that's a huge amount of processing capability that you have with extrusion, which no other technology has in the area of food processing. So it's really definitely very front and center to plant-based meat as well. I don't see any other technology at this point being used so heavily as extrusion is for making these products. There are some other technologies, but they're not been scaled up. So when you hear about companies like Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, they're all using some form of extrusion technology or the other to make their plant-based products, and which is what you see in outlets like McDonald's or retail stores and so on.
Super. That's very nice to hear. Professor Alavi, are we saying that extrusion no wonder has, let's say, the productivity is very high for extrusion? Is there any possibility of coming out with some other formulation, like, let's say, a tablet form or capsule form of these protein-based foods?
Sure. Of course, the technology is so versatile, and the possibilities also really immense. So, of course, when you have protein-based, plant-based meat products, you're really focusing on texture. So if you go to a tablet form, you don't really imitate the same texture. But yes, extrusion can be used for making pelletized or tablet-like products, and it already is in industry. A lot of the pharmaceutical industry, and you might know this, but some of the very small size pills are oftentimes extruded through a multi-hole die, and then it goes through a spherinizer to break up those long strands into small pieces, and the spherinizer then rounds up into small balls of whatever that medicine is. The medicine is just a carrier. So extrusion cum spherinizer system is already used in the pharmaceutical industry for making very small micro-sized pills. But yes, that's something which has been explored in the area of food as well. In fact, that's really more relevant to things like army rations, for example. If you want to compress nutrients into a very small, dense pellet, and which will be light and easy to carry, not very bulky, for soldiers as an example, or even for, now that the space travel is becoming more and more real, even for astronauts. So you can actually densify ingredients or nutrients into a very small form in a very dense tablet. So there's been research in the area too, and extrusion is one of the technologies, not the only technology, to make these pelletized so-called pills, which can carry a lot of nutrients together. And you can always dissolve in water, as an example, and then or break them up and use them in some other kinds of applications.
That will be wonderful. I mean, we'll have a super pill soon. Yeah, good. Okay, let me shift gear now. I also, in your CV, I also heard you had mentioned that you worked on non-invasive X-ray microtomography. Can you shed some light to our viewers?
Sure, yes. So, I work in the area of food structure, and of course, the technology to arrive at that food structure, which is extrusion, is one of them. And I was mentioning about, as an example, how plant-based meat has a very stringy, fibrous texture, unlike, say, tofu, which is based on the same ingredients, soy proteins, but it's not been texturized. So structure of food is very important and is closely linked to its sensory qualities. When you eat the food, consume the food, a lot of what we perceive, hardness or softness, or whether it's stringy meat-like or is a soft tofu-like, is dependent on the texture, and also the texture is dependent on the structure of the product. So studying food structure is also a huge part of what we do, internal structure of food products. So believe it or not, you can also study and publish papers and do research in the area of how do kurkures look from inside, or how do products like breakfast cereal, Cheerios or Fruit Loops, how they look from inside, or plant-based meat, what kind of structure they have, which relates to their sensory perception when you consume them. So when you want to look inside a food product, then of course technologies have been around for a long time, very simple technologies. A simple microscopy is available, for example, to look at the food structure, magnify it and study it and relate it to the raw materials and their quality, and also the processing conditions which are used to make those food products. So that has been around as simple optical microscopy. But X-ray tomography is a relatively recent development around overall in the technology realm for a long time. When we go to a CAT scanning facility to look at, say, a tumor, that's really X-ray tomography, using X-rays to look inside tissues. But they also have been used for looking inside geological samples, as an example. But the same technology has been miniaturized, and CAT scanning is a huge system, of course, has been miniaturized because of technological advances to be able to study food structure non-invasively. So you shoot X-rays through a food product, and then you have the food product sitting on a platform. The platform rotates incrementally, so you get these multiple X-ray radiographs, hundreds of them for a single food product. We're talking about a piece of Cheerios or a piece of kurkure or even a plant-based meat product. And once you have a 180-degree revolution of the platform, you have got those X-rays from those multiple angles, and then you use really the modern computing power we have to convert those hundreds of radiographs into one composite 3D non-invasive image of the product, which you can slice virtually in any direction, at any depth, very thin slices or thicker slices, doesn't matter, to look inside the food product. And you can then really evaluate and quantify the food product's structure. How many, for example, if you're looking at, say, Fruit Loops, how many bubbles or cellular entities are there in the product, which is what gives it porosity. What are the thickness of those walls of those cells? Because that relates to how much crunchiness we perceive when you bite into that product, how much milk is going to penetrate inside the product. When you're eating, it takes about 5 to 6 minutes to finish a bowl of cereal, but the milk penetrates into the product and makes it soggy. Some people like it soggy, some people like it more crunchy. So how fast milk penetrates in also depends on the thickness of the cell walls. So you can get all that information through X-ray tomography in a non-invasive fashion, and that's been a new development, relatively speaking, in the food industry, and started with some of the research we've done in the lab to be able to quantify and study non-invasively structure of various food products. So that's why it's becoming a very useful tool in the food industry.
Never realized kurkure has so much science behind it.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about pet foods. Pet is something in India is becoming a big fad now. Every second family wants to have a pet, maybe cat or maybe dog. And what is sorghum? We are not aware of this word.
Sorghum, you said? Right.
Yeah.
So, well, sorghum has been around in India also for a long time, and one reason why we oftentimes are not aware of sorghum, because it's really the poor man's grain, so to say. So in India, it's called jawar, and in the US, sorghum or Milo, M-I-L-O, is a common term also to describe this grain. So it is not a very mainstream cereal grain. Mainstream grains I would call would be in India would be just wheat and rice. And to some extent now people are becoming more and more aware of maize or corn. But sorghum has been around forever, and it grows actually where no other crop can grow oftentimes. It grows in arid regions where there's lack of water. It grows in dry regions, arid dry regions, and also where you have higher temperatures. So you can actually go to places in Rajasthan and you'll see a lot of sorghum growing where you can't grow wheat or rice. It requires very minimal water and it can withstand higher temperatures. As an example, but sorghum is also grown in other parts of India, including where you are, Dr. Iyer, in Andhra Pradesh. Sorghum is a big crop in Andhra Pradesh, and it actually is similar to millets. Millets, of course, is something that also a lot of people have heard. In India, we call it bajra. So jawar and bajra are what typically the poor man's crop. And you'd see jawar bajra ki roti, and that's called the poor man's roti or rukhi sukhi roti. That's what it is. But now, because of awareness of health, people have, and science has realized that these newer, quote unquote, these are really ancient crops, but these newer ingredients, mainstream ingredients now are actually better in terms of things like glycemic index. They don't release the sugar into our body as fast, which is great for health for people who have problems with diabetes or people who have obesity issues. So sorghum is becoming big, and believe it or not, because the owners, we call in the US, for example, pet parents, they have issues with diabetes and obesity. A lot of it is lifestyle related and diet related. Because of their lifestyle, the pets also have diabetes and obesity. So sorghum-based pet foods are a new venture in terms of research and also how industry is picking it up for making healthier pet food products, which are more suited for addressing obesity or even diabetes in pets. So this ancient crop is now being suddenly realized as a magic crop, and it suddenly is becoming more expensive or more valuable than the traditional wheat and rice.
Absolutely. In fact, quinoa is also becoming a big hit now here.
Quinoa is, yes, absolutely. That's a crop from, yes, originated from Latin America, but it's becoming huge. Right.
It's becoming huge, and that's a big hit.
Yes.
You also worked on nanocomposites.
Right.
Want
Yes.
to just briefly tell us about
Sure.
that?
Sure. Now, nanocomposites are really a class of materials which are used in lots of different applications in industry, beyond food industry. Food industry really is adapting it for its needs in certain areas. So whenever we use the term nano, we're really talking about nanoscale materials, materials which are smaller than micro. Micro is a millionth of a meter or a thousandth of a millimeter, but a nano would be 1/1000th of a meter. So it will be really a millionth of a millimeter. So very small scale, almost at the scale of an atom, but not quite. Maybe 10 atoms would be nano. So nanoscale. So at that scale, materials have very different properties because they have huge surface area to volume ratio, and that allows much higher surface reactivity. So you take simple thing as carbon, and you compare that with materials like graphene or carbon nanotubes, which are really forms of nanocarbon arranged in a structured fashion. So simple carbon would have very different properties than, say, nanocarbon, like carbon nanotubes or graphene, because they're at the nanoscale. They have very, very different surface active properties. They're used for these days in all kinds of applications, including sensors. We hear terms like nanosensors. We also hear terms like nano purifiers. These very small, very active materials can be used to purify things like wastewater. They can absorb, they're very highly absorbent materials. They also have sometimes extreme high strength and electrical conductivity and those various properties which you won't find in the larger scale structure of the same element, the same molecule. So nanomaterials are becoming really already a huge industry beyond food, of course, but food industry has started to adapt it for its purposes. And the research we do is in using these nanoscale materials in packaging applications, food packaging applications. So that also helps us to address trends which are aligning towards more sustainable materials. So I mentioned when I was talking about plant-based meat in the beginning that people are switching towards plant-based meat because they perceive it to be more environmentally friendly than meat. And when I say environmentally friendly, it's more environmentally sustainable. It's requiring less resources like, say, water or energy to grow the grain, which is used in plant-based meat, than to grow the grain and feed it to the animal, which is used for animal meat. So that's sustainability. Yes, in similar terms, sustainability is a big issue when it comes to packaging material for foods. And you see millions of tons of material, usually plastics, being used around the world for food packaging. And a lot of this plastic ends up in waste streams and first in the ground, and then from there, these plastics, they don't completely disintegrate. They always maintain their structure. There are a lot of toxic chemicals in those plastics too. But what they do is they get broken down to very small micro pellets over time. And these micro pellets then can be washed away with the groundwater, and they might end up in the oceans, or they might end up in other ways where they can lead to toxicity, ultimately in our food supply. A lot of times, as they go into the various oceans around the world, they tend to aggregate together. For example, there's hundreds of miles wide patch in the Pacific Ocean. It's called the Great Pacific Patch, which is just plastic in the middle of the ocean, and it goes at least a mile deep. So you can imagine that big chunk of plastic is floating around. It's just micro pellets in the Pacific, but it's also spread out around various parts of different oceans. So fish consume it, and they get the toxic plastic pellets inside their bodies. These are micro pellets, and of course, then we consume the fish. But besides that, the biodiversity of these oceans is getting affected in a huge way. That's just one example where plastics are becoming very toxic. So to be able to address this in a more sustainable way, we are working, the food industry is working towards more bio-based plastics, not petroleum-based plastics like polyethylene, but bio-based plastics. So we're using materials like starch, which is really a food material, or proteins, to develop these packaging films, as an example, or other packaging types. So starch inherently is not very strong. It's very brittle. And you can make it more flexible to make films by adding plasticizers. But again, the strength of it, how much it can be tear resistant, for example, is not so good. To improve that, nano fillers, we are working in the area of all kinds of nano fillers. One example would be just take cellulose, but use a nano form of the cellulose. It's called nanocrystalline cellulose. So it's also a biological material. But if you put that nano filler inside a starch-based film, then the film becomes stronger. And the film also becomes more impervious to water and oxygen, which is an important part of food packaging. You don't want the food to go rancid or stale. That's oxygen permeability. And you don't want the food to also absorb water from the environment or lose water to the environment. If you have a fresh, say, bunch of tomatoes, it's high in water, you don't want it to dry out. And so having a water impervious film and oxygen impervious film for packaging is very important. You also use packaging films in lots of other applications. Simple, again, kurkure, we don't realize, but there's a lot of plastic inside that packaging which is used for kurkure. It's a multi-layered packaging. It has some metallized layers, but also has plastic layers. You can make a big part of it biodegradable by using these bio-based polymers like starches and derivatives of starches and proteins, which are biodegradable and also more environmentally sustainable in terms of the fact that they're renewable. So, but again, to improve the quality of these films, properties of these films, nano fillers can become very important. And that's the area where we are working. So whenever we combine nano fillers with regular materials, they become nanocomposites. So that's an area of research of interest to us and also for industry. And that's evolving very fast.
Talking of cocoa once again, there were a lot of research and a lot of papers said that once you burn cocoa, you are left with plastic. Is it a fact that once you burn a cocoa, it turns out to a plastic? What you are left is the plastic. Is it a fact or is it just a fib?
No. I think that's, there's no truth to it. Kurkure just, usually it's made in the US depends on where and which company is making a kurkure-like product, what ingredients they use. But in the US, kurkure is made using maize or corn, very simple ingredient. In India, you might have some rice as well in it. Some people also add lentils, some companies, but it's really depending on what form of kurkure. And kurkure is just one brand, but you have things like Takatak as an example in India, same product. So I think it's Haldiram. So no, there is no plastic in it, and burning it would really eventually lead to a charred product, but it's not plastic, it's just charred, it's just really carbon, because all these starches and even lots of proteins have carbon in it. And once you burn it, what might remain eventually is carbon-based material. Our body is all carbon, by the way, and so are food materials. So that's what you will see, but it's not plastic.
Great. And one quick question before we wind up. You said that you're doing collaborative work with Indian scientists. Can you want to say something on that?
Sure, yes. We have a lot of collaborative relationships with various institutes all over India. I also come from an Indian institute, the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, IIT Kharagpur. That's where I graduated from now about 30 years back. So I still maintain very close links with my alma mater. We do work together. I come to Kharagpur to teach. I've done that before several times. I also get students from my alma mater. They come to my lab and do internships in my lab here at Kansas State University. Sometimes we go on to offer them a master's or Ph.D. position in my lab as well. So we had several people come through, but not just from my alma mater, but from other institutes around India. We work very closely, for example, with the number one agricultural university in India, which is Punjab Agricultural University. We have a very close relationship with them. We also worked with a university in Rajasthan, Maharana Pratap University of Agriculture and Technology, based in Udaipur. We also worked with very closely for years and years with a university in Andhra Pradesh, erstwhile Andhra Pradesh, now still in Andhra Pradesh, Acharya N.G. Ranga Agricultural University, Angrao. So we have had very close relationships with that university as well. So really spread across a lot of different institutions in India. We've had also great partnerships with the Central Institute, which is for agricultural research, which is Indian Council of Agricultural Research, ICAR, which is the primary body which oversees all agricultural research all over India. And also the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, IARI, based out of Delhi, but having lots of different research branches all over the country. So a lot of good collaboration with Indian institutes of research in the area of agriculture and food processing, and also with Indian industry. So we worked with lots of industry clients and people who have questions, and we've done courses in India, short courses for 3 days or 2 days for Indian industry for the last 20 years now.
Fantastic. That's really good.
Thank you very much.
And I think we'll have to wind up now. It's getting late now for you and for us too. And thank you so much, Dr. Alavi. It was a pleasure talking to you, and you have so much of information, and I can keep on going.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.